All right, so we're going to talk about how to find slope from a graph. And I will also then add how to find slope if you were just given the points. So slope is how inclined a line is. So for example, if you have a straight line like this, then the slope is undefined, which means for every x, there is an infinite number of y. It's like being in several places at the same time. It's just physically impossible. Lines like these are not really functions. You cannot write what y equals la 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 x. This right here is just x equals 1 and that's it. There's no connection with y. Now if you see a horizontal line like this, we say that the slope for it is 0 because as the x changes its values, there is only one y. Again, there is no connection between y equals la 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 x. Now these two lines that we see here have different slopes and we are going to figure out what those slopes exactly are. In order to do that, we need to find some specific points whose values are very clear. For example, I can see that for x that equals 3, I have y that also equals 3. And then I have this y-intercept right here, which is very clear, and I can use that one. So once I've figured out my points, I just need to make a triangle. And now once we have this triangle, we just need to figure out how big those sides are. This would be 6 and this would be 3. Now the saying goes that a slope is rise over run. By the run, we mean how our x changes. And then the run is always positive. It's always to the right, from left to right. So we are running 3 points from left to right. So that's our run. Now the rise, it's iffy because it can be a rise or a drop. In our case, we have a rise. And the way you figure it out whether it's a rise or a drop, if you go to the right, you are going to be climbing up this graph, which means that you are rising. And now all we need to do is just figure out what the slope is. Now the symbol for slope is m, and then we just take our rise, which was 6, and we divide it by run, which was 3, and that gives us 2. So the slope for this line is 2. Now we're going to look on the graph on the right. Here we have the x and y intercepts that are very clear. We have 0, 2, and we have 2, 0. Again, I'm going to shade in this triangle and then figure out how big the sides are. This is 2 by 2. But as opposed to the previous graph on the left, here we have a drop. Again, we think if I go to the right through my run of 2, I'm actually going to go down the graph. So I'm rolling down. I'm not climbing up, I'm rolling down. So this is a drop. But again, you can use that formula slope equals, but instead of a rise, you're going to say drop. And all you need to remember is drop is negative. So we have m being negative 2 because it's a drop over 2 and negative 1. So that's how you figure out a slope if you have a graph. Now, how do you figure out a slope if you have the points, or if you see a graph and you just pick those points and you don't want to mess with triangles? And the way you do it should sort of remind you about how you find distance between 2 points on a coordinate system. We will make a table, write down the coordinates in there, and then we will subtract them. 3, 3, 0, negative 3. When we subtract them, we end up with 3 and 6. Now, algebraically, we will write m as change in y over change in x. In other words, this little triangle stands for change. Delta, the way we pronounce it in English is delta. Anyway, so we have the change of y, y1 minus y2, and we have to do the same thing for x, x1 minus x2. Now, the thing is, it does not really matter which point you subtract from which. I just switched the points. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to subtract, and that will give me negative 3 and negative 6. But the slope is still how did my y change versus how my x changed. My y changed by negative 6, and my x changed by negative 3, which will still give me a 2. Now if we look at the graph on the right, the same story. I wrote first I took 0, 2, the second point is 2, 0, and ended up with a negative 2 for the change in x and 2 for a change in y. Then you do 2 over negative 2 gets you a negative 1, and then I just switch the points, and I end up with 2, 0 as the first point, 0, 2 as the second point. Subtracting, now I have 2 for delta x and negative 2 for delta y, but again, when you figure out the slope, it's going to be just m equals negative 2 over 2, which ends up as negative 1. And when you have two coordinates, or whether you have the actual graph that you can look at, you can figure out the slope. If it's a graph, it's easy just to make a triangle and divide one side by the other, the vertical side by the horizontal side. Just remember, if the graph is pointing up, then it's a rise and it's a positive number. And if the graph is pointing down, then it's a drop. Then you need to put the negative number in the numerator of your slope. That is essentially how you figure out the slope of a line. And in the next video, I'll go over the slope-intercept form for a graph.